Well, the U.S. faced a decision on how to respond to the rise in China back in the Clinton administration. There were some people who said, contain China before it comes too strong. And the Clinton administration basically said, no, bring China into the international system. And we chose that rather than the containment option. And that's why the Clinton administration invited China into the World Trade Organization, accepted Chinese trade in the U.S., including a trade deficit, and basically felt that it was important to bring China into the international system. At the same time, some people said, but suppose China turns out to be a bully or doesn't play by the rules. And that's where the insurance or the hedge came in, which is that by reaffirming the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, we made sure that if China became a bully, it would face both Japan and the United States together. So that's the hedge, or the insurance policy. But the idea, the basic idea, was to integrate China into the international system, not to try to contain China or prevent the rise of China. Well, I think the U.S. policy overall has been successful. You have to always compare a policy to its alternative. And if the alternative was, as suggested in the 90s, the idea of containing China or trying to hold China back, I think would have led to quite difficult relations between the U.S. and China. I don't think China would be as much a participant in the international system. And I don't think it would necessarily have been successful holding China back. I think that China has made enormous progress with raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and I think much of that would have happened despite efforts by the United States to hold China back. Well, I think from the point of view of the United States, the fact that China is what Robert Zoellick called a responsible stakeholder, that it has become a major participant in the international system, including institutions. It adheres to its obligations under the World Trade Organization. When there are decisions that go against it, it adheres to those decisions. It has become a major provider of troops for United Nations peacekeeping. It has been a major supporter of the objectives of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. For example, it supported the sanctions against Iran that helped to bring about the conditions for the U.S.-Iran nuclear agreement. So I think China has done a number of things which indicate that it has been willing to become a responsible stakeholder. Not on everything, but on some major issues. Well, I think the Obama position was an implied criticism of its predecessor, the Bush administration, which had focused very heavily on the Middle East, and particularly the mistaken invasion of Iraq meant that enormous amounts of money and attention was spent on the Middle East. And Obama wanted to redress that imbalance by saying, let's focus more on Asia, which is the most rapidly growing part of the international economy. For those Chinese friends who say that our policy is containment, I say go back and read history. Containment during the Cold War meant there was almost no trade between the United States and the Soviet Union, very little social contact. And if you contrast that with the U.S.-China relations, there's not only massive trade between the two countries, you have hundreds of thousands of students who are going to school in the two countries. So that's not containment. I mean, that's historically, if people are careful in their use of the terms, This is not containment. Well, I think the United States and China should both understand that the United States remains a power in the Western Pacific. That doesn't mean there needs to be conflict between the countries. I think conflict can be avoided. But the extent to which the people who worried about China trying to drive America out of the Western Pacific and past what's sometimes called the first island chain, forget that part of the first island chain is the islands of Japan, which is an American ally. The idea that China would drive the Americans away beyond the first island chain, including breaking our alliance with Japan, is just not going to happen. So that's a formula for conflict, but it doesn't have to be. Well, the United States and China have developed mill-to-mill contacts, which I think help. We have a procedure for handling possible dangerous incidents that could occur at sea. President Xi Jinping and President Obama have agreed on increasing the number of military contacts. China is going to participate in the RIMPAC exercises in the Pacific. So there are a number of measures of that sort that are ongoing, but I think equally important will be high-level discussions at the political level, not just at the mill-to-mill level. You need both. The initial American opposition to the AIIB was mistaken, and I think President Obama came around to that point of view, and by April of 2015, he'd already said that we no longer had opposition to other countries joining the AIIB. I think there was too much worry about the idea that it was a replacement for the World Bank. It really is a supplement, and the fact that it will have members from other countries means that it'll have a board and more transparency than it would have if it were just a bilateral Chinese aid agency. Well, the U.S. has already adapted to some extent. The Congress finally passed the reallocation of quotas within the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly the IMF, which increased China's role. So I think you're beginning to see that. On political institutions, the U.S. obviously works with China in the G20, and of course the U.S. and China work together in the UN Security Council. So I think there has been actually a fair amount of adaptation. Well, there are a couple of questions. One is the question of transition of power. Some people think that China is going to pass the U.S. and that type of power transition will lead to a conflict. Sometimes people call that the Thucydides trap. And in my book that you referred to, Is the American Century Over?, I argue that China is not passing the U.S. and that the analogies to Thucydides or to World War I are mistaken. For example, by 1900, Germany had become more powerful in industry than the United States. I don't see China as becoming more powerful than than Britain, with Germany versus Britain. I don't see China becoming more powerful than the U.S. in the next several decades. And what that means is that the U.S. and China have time to manage the relationship. So even though there may be tensions between a rising power and established power, they're not a situation where China is about to pass the U.S. or is so hard on the heels of the U.S. that the U.S. should succumb to fear or China should succumb to hubris. So in that sense, there's room to develop practices of cooperation if the two countries both have an interest in managing the relationship. And in those institutional practices of cooperation, there are a number of areas where the U.S. and China have common interests. Take climate change. Neither of us can solve that problem alone. Both of us could be hurt if we don't cooperate. And there's been progress. If you compare the U.S. and China in 2009 at the Copenhagen meetings with 2015 at the Paris meetings, we have made a good deal of progress in getting closer together on that. Or take the issue of cyber and China's theft of American intellectual property by cyber means. President Obama and President Xi Jinping reached an agreement at their summit meeting last September that China or no country would steal intellectual property by cyber means. We remain to see how it works out in detail, but at least there has been progress on it. And there are other areas like international monetary stability where the two countries have a common interest. So I think there will always be tensions between major powers, but there are also areas of common interest. And we have to keep a balance between the questions which give rise to tensions, such as the South China Sea, and areas where we can cooperate and have much to gain from cooperation. Well, I think the most important thing is to keep a perspective about the importance of cooperation, of maintaining the cooperative aspects of the relationship. There is both conflict and cooperation, and the important thing is to keep a sense of balance between those two. So I think that's the general philosophical basis. But within that, of issues, I think within the last year or two, you've seen progress on currencies and monetary stability. You've seen progress, as I mentioned, on cyber cooperation. You've seen progress on climate cooperation. The area where there hasn't been progress, in which, from the American point of view, the Chinese have been going in the wrong direction, has been primarily on their assertion of sovereign claims over the international waters of the South China Sea. So I would say that's probably the issue which is top of the agenda now. The regime in North Korea under Kim Jong-un is very unpredictable, possibly unstable, and if there is some sort of crisis in North Korea, it could have very powerful effects on China and on the U.S. And it's an area I think that the U.S. and China should be discussing privately with each other to make sure we don't make the types of miscalculations that occurred in the Korean War. Well, I think from what I hear from Chinese friends is that China is getting fed up with Pyongyang. They said don't have a nuclear explosion, and Pyongyang thumps its nose at China and goes right ahead. So in that sense, I think there's a growing irritation in Beijing about the actions of Pyongyang and a realization that adventuresome actions by Pyongyang can hurt China. After all, in 2010, when North Korea sank the South Korean frigate, the Chonan, one of the results of this was American ships going into the Yellow Sea. China complained about that, but the Americans replied, if you don't want that, then do more to restrain North Korea, because its adventures are hurting everybody. So I think there is a realization that coming down a little bit harder on North Korea is important. China did support UN sanctions. On the other hand, they're not enough to change North Korean behavior. I think China is going to have to get a bit tougher with North Korea out of its own interest. Well, there is something of a theory-practice divide. If you're in government, you can't spend too much time thinking about theory. You're trying to respond to events, and events happen with rapidity and often without your being able to control them. When you're in an academic setting, time isn't nearly as important. You have more time to step back and think about the meaning of something, and you can do more theorizing. There's a role for both, and I think that the big difference I noticed of working in government and working in academia is this difference in terms of time. In government, time makes a difference to everything. If you don't get something done on time, it's a failure. In academia, you can take much more time, and you work on getting the answer just right rather than worrying about the exact timing of it. So there's a big difference in the tempo or pace of life and the role of time, but both are interesting and both provide opportunities. The danger is that academics see things fitting more into patterns than they actually do. And as Harold Macmillan once referred, the former British Prime Minister once answered a question about what is the most important thing in terms of driving policy, and he said events. And the problem is that you can't control events. They're surprising and unpredictable. And that ability to respond to events and to manage events and the disruptions and the unpredictable is indeed a big difference.